Hello again. Welcome back to another week for the junior high kids. I am hoping that you're all well. You guys have done a good job of reaching out to me. I've gotten questions and comments from people. Please keep them coming. Call me, email me, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. Um, there's no question that's too silly. All right, there are no silly questions. Just bring them on because this is not an ideal way for me to do this class. And you guys are being troopers, so thank you for that. This past week, you should have been working on your report on bestiaries, your 5-paragraph formal essay on bestiaries. I am hoping that by the time you're watching this video, you have done all 3 outlines, your fused outline, and you have begun writing the body paragraphs of your paper. Remember why we do the body paragraphs first. We do them first because it's easier to introduce something you've already written, right? So if you've already know what you're going to say, it's easy to tell in your introduction what you're going to say. So I'm hoping that you have at least 2 of the 3 body paragraphs done by now. If you don't, you need to step it up a little bit. I hope you are not waiting to do the whole paper the second week. The reason I'm giving you 2 weeks is so that you can do a really good job, so that you can do a rough draft and you can go back over the rough draft and you can see where you can make it better. That's what your rough draft is for. So don't try to write this out all in one try. Write it out and then go back over it. It's a good idea to set it aside for a day, at least a day, if not a couple of days, and then go back to it, and you will find the places that you could make better. You will find places that aren't as clear as you thought they were. You know in your own head what you want to say, but your reader doesn't know what you wanted to say. And so sometimes you leave out key pieces of information and you don't realize you've done it. Another thing I urge you to do before you send me your final draft next week, this will be due next week, is to read it out loud. I've told you this before in class. Read it out loud. If you want to read it to a family member, that's great. Read it to your pet. Your pet will not criticize, probably. Or you could just go into a room and read it to yourself out loud. But the reading out loud, you know this. Some of you have read your papers out loud to me in class to share them, and you've caught your own mistakes while you're reading them out loud. So reading out loud is key to catching your mistakes. All right, so this week you will be finishing the body paragraphs. Then you will be adding an introduction and a conclusion. I want you to write this. When you send me your final draft, don't put headings, introduction, then the introduction. Then, don't give titles to your paragraphs. This is one paper, one seamless paper. Now, let's review what you should have in your introduction. Can you remember? First of all, you need to do something to catch attention. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. Next, you should tell me whatever background I need to understand your paper. So if you were writing about a book, you would tell me the title and author of the book. In this case, you're writing about a topic, and your topic is bestiaries. So in a sentence or 2, you need to tell me what is a bestiary. Just sum it up. You're going to talk more about that in the body of your paper, but you need to give me some information to give it context. All right. And then you're going to tell me the 3 topics that you're going to talk about in each paragraph. 1 topic per paragraph. So I think I gave you topics, ideas like what is a bestiary, what's in it, what's the history behind them, what sort of illustrations, why are the animals so weird, that sort of thing. You need to tell me in your introduction what 3 topics you've decided to discuss. In your conclusion, I want you to restate the 3 topics that you have discussed in the paper. Remember the rule. If you want people to remember what you said, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. So in the conclusion, you tell them what you told them. Choose one that you find most significant. This is completely your own opinion. All right, there's no wrong answer to this. Choose one that you think is most significant. That can mean the one you think is coolest, the one you think is most interesting, the one you think has most impact on later history or the world in general, the one you think is morally most important. It depends on what the topics are. But this is your opinion. Like I said, no wrong answer. Okay? If you have any questions about the writing of your paper, please reach out to me, either by phone or email. I am asking you to put dress-ups and sentence openers in your introduction and conclusion. This is going to force some of you to fill out your introductions and conclusions. They've been a little scanty, some of them, a little short. So I need you to fill that out enough that you can put dress-ups and openers in them. The checklist I emailed to you last week had a full 5 boxes for each dress-up and sentence opener. You are only required to do the sentence openers we have been doing. I think next paper we're going to add a new sentence opener, maybe a couple. For those of you who were only doing dress-ups for me, that's fine. Just keep doing that to the best of your ability. Now, I told you a moment ago that we were going to talk about those attention getters in your introduction. And I emailed to each of you a paper. Let me grab it. And it is called Dramatic Openers. So, as always, I hope that before you started watching the video, you have printed out the materials I've sent you. I'm trying to send those out on Sunday evenings for the videos that are going to be available on Monday mornings. So you should have gotten that. If you didn't, for any reason, please let me know. You should have gotten that, and I hope that you print those out. Have those available before you watch the video. Also, it's good to have pen and paper, something to take notes on in case you have a question or a comment, or I say something that you just want to remember to do. Remember, you can always rewatch the videos. That's the great thing about doing this. The downside is I don't get to give you in-person feedback, and I miss seeing all of you. But the upside is you can watch me say this over and over and over again. I don't know why you would, but if you don't remember something, or if you're really, really looking for something to do because you're bored, hey, I'm here. Watch me again. So get out the paper that says Dramatic Openers Hooks. Let's take a look at those. Before we talked about some openers like asking a question or giving a command. Let's fill that out. Let's give you some more options since you're going to be writing an introduction this week. Let's take a look at some of the things you could do. The first one, we already talked about, ask a question. Their example is, what is of more value than gold? And it's, if you were starting an essay on friendship, perhaps. Giving a fact or a statistic. This is a paper about a trip to Washington, D.C. I was 13 years old when I first visited our nation's capital. For your bestiary paper, it could be something like, animals have always fascinated me, or I enjoy my pets. And then you go on to talk about some animals that, I don't know, maybe you'd like to have as pets. Maybe some of those weird bestiary creatures you don't ever want to have as a pet. A quote is the next way. Here's a report on the Constitution. You could start it with, "We the people of the United States." You could quote the document that you're talking about. Okay. Shock. This is very dramatic. This is an essay on watching too much TV, which might be a danger for you right now. Television is electronic heroin. It's a drug. This is shocking. Ooh. I need to read this paper because I don't want to be hooked on a drug and I need to know the dangers of watching too much television. So shocking your reader. So you could describe one of these crazy bestiary beasts, one of the weirder type, just to get people involved and surprise them. Okay, suspended interest. This is to drop a little hint, but the reader doesn't know where it's going. So here's an example from a report on the Bermuda Triangle. If you don't know what the Bermuda Triangle is, it's a place in the Caribbean. It's roughly a triangle shaped area in the sea where supposedly a lot of airplanes and ships have just disappeared without a trace. So here's their suspended interest. No one has been able to explain the strange disappearances. Doesn't that make you want to find out? What disappeared? What happened to them? Does anyone know? So this is leading them in by not giving them enough information to know what's going on, but leaving them wanting more information. All right. The next one we talked about, an imperative. You Latin students of mine, impero means command. I commands. An imperative sentence is a command. Here's a report on outer space. Look into the heavens and count the stars if you can. This is actually a quote from Scripture. God said this to Abraham as well. Fragments. Now, Nate called me this week with a couple of questions, or last week, and noticed Mark Twain using a fragment in the Joan of Arc book that we're reading. And I told him, and I will tell all of you what my answer was, when you know the rules, you may break the rules for a reason, not just because you were sloppy or you just wanted to. It needs a reason. And one reason for using fragments is they can be very dramatic, especially when there are several short fragments in a row. And so on your sheet here, this is about a writer's first day working in a daycare center. Kids everywhere, as far as I could see. All right, this is dramatic. These are fragments. These are not complete sentences. But if you use a fragment for a reason, a defendable, dramatic reason, it's okay. Those of you who are still struggling with fragments in your paper, though, I would discourage this. I need to know that you can consistently write sentences and not have them be fragments before I let you change the rules, okay? But one place where you would all be allowed to do this is your dramatic opener for your introduction. All right, the last one, they call it name dropping. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before. Name dropping is mentioning something famous or someone famous to get everyone to pay attention. So if you go to a party and you say, oh, yes, I had dinner with, I'm trying to think of somebody famous, President Trump last week, and they're like, ooh, you had dinner with the president? And everybody's interested in you. So here's their name dropping. The Statue of Liberty is a welcoming symbol of freedom. This is a report on Ellis Island where many immigrants came through in the 19th century. So mentioning a famous landmark or a famous person, if someone is interested in that landmark or that person, they may want to really pursue reading your paper because they want to know more about that. Okay? Now, this is not an exhaustive list of things you can do to catch attention, but it's a pretty thorough list. So what I'd like each of you to do is to use one of these as your dramatic opener, not quoting the Constitution or saying television is electronic heroin, but use one of these techniques to open your paper. All right? And I'd love to know if you want to write in the margin of your paper, or let me know which one you're using. Okay? Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about with your writing, and I sent you another attachment, and it is called transitional words and phrases. Please get that one out and take a look at it with me. Transitional words and phrases are ways to connect one sentence with the next or one paragraph with the next. For you guys, that's probably the most important. Sometimes you picked your 3 topics and your paragraphs can seem rather unconnected to each other because you haven't transitioned. And we haven't really talked about this, so I'm not blaming you for that, but I'd like us to try to work on that, tying one paragraph to another. So first of all, let's look at the paper together And we'll see how we might use some of these to connect our sentences or our paragraphs. On the first page, I've given you 2 pages. First of all, let's talk about something. When you connect 2 ideas, either 2 sentences or 2 paragraphs, we need to know how they're connected. Did one of them lead to the next? For example, I woke up and heard the storm outside with thunder, lightning, and rain beating against the windows. Sentence. And then in my next sentence, I'm going to say, I took an umbrella with me when I went out. Now, how are those related? Obviously, hearing the storm led to you taking the umbrella with you. So instead of just saying, I woke up and heard the storm, blah, 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 end of sentence, I took an umbrella with me when I went out. We would say, as a result, I took my umbrella with me. Therefore, I took my umbrella with me. And you see how it connects. It connects what happened in one sentence to the other. So that's one way things could be connected. One is, so that's sequence and time. Let's go back to your paper, sequence and time. The next section is words that show addition or link thoughts. So what if you are, I'm trying to think about your bestiary paper now. Maybe you're comparing modern books to medieval books. And you say, many people today really appreciate the pictures in books, and there are great artists that illustrate books today. Similarly, in the Middle Ages, illustrations were a key part of books. Do you see how I compared them? I said, just like it happens today, similarly, or in like manner, or equally, people in the Middle Ages appreciated illustrations. So I've tied them. Another similar technique would be below words that give examples. All right. If you state something and then in the next sentence you give an example of it, you might want to start that sentence, for example, for instance, a case in point, in fact. They connect. They say, I've told you something, and now I'm going to give you a specific example of it. And so your reader can follow your idea. At the bottom of that first page, it says words to emphasize. This would be a great one to use in your conclusion when you are telling me which of the 3 topics, which 3 of the 3 points you thought was most significant. Indeed, without a doubt, significantly, primarily, most importantly. All of these words would let me know exactly what that next sentence is doing. It is telling me which one you found to be most significant. All right, second page. Words that show cause and effect. This is similar to the time sequence with the storm and the umbrella. Words to compare, words to contrast, okay? Comparing things that are similar in some way, contrasting things that are different in some way. We were just a moment ago comparing modern illustrations and medieval illustrations. Perhaps we would like to contrast by pointing out that although we have many modern books that are printed by printing presses, we could say, in contrast, medieval books were all written and illustrated by hand. So we've shown a way that they are different. And then words to summarize or conclude. This would be a great way to begin your conclusion, wouldn't it? Now, I've given you some examples of tying sentences together, but this can also be done with paragraphs. Opening up your paragraph, how is one paragraph related to the paragraph above? So maybe in your first paragraph, you've talked about what is a bestiary, what's in it. And in the next paragraph, you want to talk specifically about the illustrations. Maybe we want to use one of the example openers. A case in point, specifically, we could use those to say, I'm going to specifically talk about illustrations. I've talked about the contents of bestiaries in general in one paragraph. Now I'm going to talk about specifically illustrations. Now, you don't need to go crazy with these. It's okay. You don't have to use one of these in every sentence. In fact, if you do, let me put this down. If you do, they start to lose effect. Use them sparingly. But when you notice that you have two thoughts that are definitely related in some way, one thought leads to another, one thought is an example of another, one thought summarizes another, consider using some sort of transitional word or phrase that ties them together to make it easier for your reader to follow your train of thought. Remember at the beginning of the video I said that you know what you want to say, but your reader doesn't necessarily know. Sometimes we leave things out because they're in our own heads and we know what's in our own heads, so we don't make them explicit on the paper. So our reader, who can't read our minds, only our pages, only our words, doesn't know what we were driving at. So we can make the train of thought more obvious by showing our reader how our minds were working by using those transitions. Okay? If you have any questions about using those, give me a call, email me an example. I'm going to say this in my paper. Is this a good idea? And I'll get back to you. But give them a try. I think, especially for those of you that are really very good writers at this point, this is a way to add great oomph to your paper, to take it up a notch, to make it very, very readable. Some of you are already naturally doing this because good writers do this. And so if you do a lot of reading, especially nonfiction reading, but any sort of reading, you probably read this enough that you've absorbed the idea. But I thought that it would be worth showing all of you. So again, that's all I have to say about your writing. Papers are due next week. Monday, if at all possible. It would be great if people would send me things on Mondays. Oh, also, while it's in my head, so below the video, you can write comments. So you can also ask questions there. You could also just comment. It doesn't have to be a question. If there's something you think is interesting in the video, something I talked about, make a comment. Maybe one of the other students will comment back, and since we can't have live conversations with each other, perhaps we can have an online discussion commenting under the video. So feel free to do that as well. Okay, this past week, I asked you to read from the Dorothy Mills book, the beginning of the section on the 100 Years' War, which obviously we're reading about as we're reading our Joan of Arc book. We'll talk about Joan of Arc here in a little bit. But grab your Dorothy Mills book, or pause the video if you need to go get it. Let me grab mine. And turn to chapter 21. In chapter 21, there is an introduction about the 100 Years' War in general, reminding you the reason behind all of this mess, the main reason, is that English kings are French vassals of the French king, because William the Conqueror, a Frenchman from Normandy, conquered England, and now his descendants are kings of England. So the King of England is at the same time Duke of Normandy, and then plus from other intermarriage. Remember Henry II? He's the Robin Hood king, the guy who reneged on the safe passage for Robin Hood. His wife Eleanor of Aquitaine is French. So there's this constant connection between England and France, and it was just a matter of time before English kings were going to claim more rights in France, or France was going to try to stomp out English authority in France. Now, one thing's going on in this time period that they didn't really talk about in your book. It's a difficult concept, but I want to explore it. Throughout much of the Middle Ages, countries were not individual entities with a very, very strong king. There were countries, but more than that, there were areas of countries. We talked about this under dukes, under noblemen, that feudal system. And often the king, the person who was technically the king of a whole country, wasn't all that powerful. A lot of the power in an individual area was held by the church. The Pope, and we've talked about that a bit this year too, the Pope claimed power not only over spirits of people, but over realms, over earthly kingdoms, and often exercised that power pretty fiercely by putting an entire country under interdict, where as punishment for something that the leaders did, no one could have any church functions at all. No baptisms, no marriages, no funerals, no mass. All right? So because that power was concentrated in the hands of the Pope, kings didn't have a lot of power and individual countries didn't have a lot of power. As we move into the later Middle Ages, so in the 1300s, 1400s, we start to see kings take control. We start to see them push back against the Pope and say, no, you don't have the right to do that. You are a spiritual leader. You are not an earthly leader. That's not the way it's supposed to be. I'm the earthly leader. I'm the king. And you can't tell me what to do with my kingdom. So they were taking command of their own countries. And as they did that, countries tended to, the idea of being patriotic. This is my country, not just my town. This is my country. And I will fight for my country and the rights of my country. So you can probably see how with people thinking in a new way about their country, a relationship between England and France that worked for a while isn't going to work so well anymore, because people are starting to say, this is France. Why are these English people here? And England's starting to say, we are England, and part of England is that land over there in France that has always belonged to us, that belonged to my grandma, my grandpa, and we want to take it back for us. All right. So I also sent you a map. Put this down for a minute. And it looks like this. It is the map of France during the 100 Years' War. All right, so get that out. And what I'd like you to look at on that map is on the left, you see what is held in England, by England, I'm sorry, in 1328. All right, do you see that? The dark color. And then the stripe is by 1360. This is what England has taken. This is the part that we read about this week. Now, on the right side, look, held by England in 1429. That's the beginning of Joan of Arc's campaigns. Okay? Do you see how much? Compare the two sides. Look at held by England in 1360. Go to the right side. Look at held by England in 1429. Oh my goodness, it's half of France. You can see Domremy over there on the right. And then, this is kind of a spoiler alert, but look at the held by England in 1453. The port of Calais. That's it. So today's reading concentrates more on the left-hand map. Next week's reading, the reading you're going to do this week, is going to concentrate more on the right-hand side. So hold on to this map. Keep it. Refer to it, because they also mark sites of major battles. Do you see places where there are little swords, crossed swords? Those are battle sites. So we can see Crécy and Poitiers on the left-hand map, both of which battles you read about this week. All right, so please refer to this map. It will help you understand better what's going on in your readings. All right. So when we start off in part 1, called The Black Prince and Crécy, it's a little bit confusing because we have King of England, Edward III, and then we have the Count of Flanders, and it gets a little confusing. Let me try to explain that to you. So Flanders is the country just to the north and slightly to the east of France, up the coast. And Flanders the Count of Flanders was supporting France, the French king. But the merchants of Flanders didn't want to support the French king because they made their money from England. It says the wool trade was closely bound up with England. They say, you know what, the Count of Flanders, he becomes allied with the King of France, we're going to suffer. Our business is going to suffer. So we'd rather be allied against England. The Pope steps in and he's pro-King of France. Now, the merchants, they call them burghers. The burghers are the merchants, the tradesmen, the wool merchants. And they have promised to support the King of France. Notice what I just said. They have promised to support the King of France. If they don't, the Pope will punish them. But they didn't say who has to be the King of France. So they approached the King of England like, hey, dude, you should be King of France. Why don't you claim the Kingdom of France? And then we can keep our promise to support the King of France, because the King of France will be you. Edward III then, on this advice, moves in. There's more to it than that. There's another thing going on, which is France is constantly stirring up Scotland. Scotland, to the north of England. They don't get along really well, Scotland and England. So the King of France says, if I get the Scottish to keep attacking England from the north and keep them busy, they won't bother with me. This was very annoying to England, to have Scotland constantly attacking them with the backing of the King of France. So this was another element that led to it. But the King of England, Edward III, calls himself King of France. And by the way, this isn't just a random thing. He actually did have a claim to the Kingdom of France. He didn't just decide to take over another country for no reason at all. There was a rule in France that you could not pass down the kingship through a woman. So if you were king and you had a daughter and the daughter had a son, so the son is the king's grandson, he couldn't become king because it was passed down through a woman. Edward III held a right to the King of France through a woman. But he was more closely in line for the throne than the actual King of France. Does that make sense? The King of France only got to be King of France because he held his title through a man. Edward III would hold it through a woman. And he decided, you know what? I don't care. Silly rule. I'm taking it. Because I ought to be king of France. I'm more closely related to the former king than the current King of France is. So it wasn't a crazy idea. All right. So he moves in, and the first thing is a sea battle, which they talk about in the Dorothy Mills book. I'm not going to go into that too much. They win the sea battle. There's a peace treaty, but in 1346, the peace treaty expires. Edward sets out again, and he takes his son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince. He was called the Black Prince because he was given black armor. He had this black armor, and everybody would know who he was when he came across the battlefield. And he was a terror. The guy was a great fighter. So that's why they call him the Black Prince. He brought the Black Prince with him, and it says, at Crécy, they met the French. The French outnumbered the English, but they lost the battle. You know, the French were known as outstanding soldiers. This was a complete embarrassment. Not only did they have the numbers, but they were notorious for being great fighters. And here these English guys come in, and they beat them. This is a story you're going to hear again in the 100 Years' War. So at the top, well, if your book looks like mine, it's at the top of page 342. It says, here's the problem. The French were still fighting as they had fought in the Crusades. Knights on horseback, clad in armor and armed with a lance, together with Genoese crossbowmen, formed the bulk of the French army. The English army, on the other hand, was chiefly made up of yeomen, or good sturdy yeomen like Robin Hood, fighting on foot with the terrible longbow. They had learned the use of this weapon in the wars of Edward I against the Welsh and Scottish. The longbow was made the height of a man who used it. That's why it's long. It's like 6 feet tall. And the steel-pointed arrow shot from it carried for 100 yards and could penetrate the armor of knight or horse. The English longbow is a wonder of military achievement. So, I sent you 2 other attachments. First of all, I sent you a picture, a medieval illustration from a book about the 100 Years' Wartime, and it's labeled Battle of Crécy. Look at that picture. In the lower left-hand corner, you see French soldiers, and they've got these crossbows, and some of them are setting them down on the ground, and because they've got to crank them, they load it, and they've got to crank it back to get ready to shoot. On the right-hand side of the picture, you see the English longbowmen, and they're just letting them fly. Apparently, a good, well-trained English longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute. Think of that. 10 a minute is one every 6 seconds. Every 6 seconds, another arrow is going. And because of the size and the strength of these bows, they could shoot straight through your armor. No kidding. No wonder the French were losing. It wasn't numbers. It was technology. Now, I was doing some reading about the longbow. I also sent you a link to a guy who, it's called Shadiversity. And this guy does all sorts of videos on medieval technology. So I sent you a link to using the English medieval longbow, which I thought you might find entertaining. You might find other videos online as well. But while I was doing some research about the longbow, I found out this interesting fact. The last recorded use of a longbow in a battle in war was World War II. In 1944, an English soldier killed a German with a longbow. Cool. Anyway, so that is the story of the English longbow. Maybe this talk will spark an interest in you and you'll want to look into it further. I also read one other interesting fact, that a ship had sunk hundreds of years ago that was filled with English longbowmen on their way to France. And when they dredged up the ship and they found the remains of the sailors who had died, one side of their bodies, the bones, because the bodies had rotted away, you know, the bones were like twice as big as the other side. Their spines were twisted. This was from practice with the longbow. It's mega weightlifting. It would be like weightlifting only on one side. Don't do that. Because they body built one side at the expense of the other, the side that drew the bow. Because it took so much strength and effort. That actually deformed their bodies. These guys did nothing but train with the longbow. And they were, during the 100 Years' War, they were practically invincible. All right. So this is why in this battle, and in battles you're going to read about in this upcoming week, the French lose even though they have more men. It's because they don't have the technology. They're still prancing around on their horses. And think about it. You're a knight on a horse. You are just a sitting duck for a guy with a bow and arrows that can shoot through your armor. One other interesting fact that Dorothy Mills brings out, she says, the Battle of Crécy was the beginning of the end of feudal fighting. It is said that gunpowder was used probably for the first time in a medieval battle. Think about that. Gunpowder will blow you off your horse. The old idea of knights on horseback isn't going to work anymore. It's not going to work anymore. And the French just didn't get the memo. They didn't realize they were using, we would say, outdated, obsolete technology. It was good in its time, but other things had come to make it useless. All right. So, during the battle, Edward, the Black Prince, was very hard pressed, and there's a story in which he sent, he didn't send, but some of the men around him sent to the king, who was watching the battle from a windmill, that he needed help. And, well, said the king, return to him, and to them that sent you hither, and say to them that they send no more to me for any adventure that falleth, as long as my son is alive. And also say to them that they suffer him this day to win his spurs. For if God be pleased, I will this journey be his, and the honor thereof, and to them that be about him. This is his moment of glory. I'm not going to go rescue him. I don't think, it wasn't that he didn't care about him. He just knew his son was grown up. His son was an incredible fighter, and it was time for him to be a man. So he said, no, I'm not going to send help. Let him do it himself. And he did. He did. He was a terror to the French. They went on from that battle and besieged the port of Calais, which you see on your map that I sent you. And Calais is the siege where finally the besieged in Calais gave up, and the king said the terms of surrender are you completely surrender to my mercy. And they said, well, if we surrender, won't you spare us? And he said, no, I'll do what I want. And finally he said, if you send me out 6 guys, put them in my hands, I get to treat them however I want, but the rest of you will be spared. And they actually had volunteers in Calais. 6 guys who said, yeah, they were wealthy, well-to-do guys, but they loved the rest of the town too much to just let everyone be killed. And they said, I'll volunteer. I'll be willing to lay down my life so the rest of you can be spared. The king was going to execute them, but his wife begged him not to. I want you to think about that for a moment. You know, when a king uses power, it can create fear in subjects, right? They know that they'd better obey because the king can do with them what he wants. But if you were king, would you rather people obeyed you because they feared you or because they loved you? We're none of us kings and queens. We don't have to make that decision. But this is a decision that leaders in history have had to make. Would I rather be feared or would I rather be loved? It's actually not as easy a question as it sounds. Probably you're thinking, well, I'd rather be loved. We all want to be liked, right? I'd rather they loved me. But the love of people can be fickle. Not the love of an individual who truly loves you, but the love of the masses, of the entire population of a country. It can be fickle based on circumstances. You know, when things are going well, they love you. When things are not going well, even if it's not your fault, maybe they don't love you anymore. If people fear you, they will obey you. That's good. But what might they do if they fear you? If they really fear you? Well, they might rebel against you. They might find your rule so oppressive that they don't want to have you as king anymore. It's a hard decision. Edward III, by turning over the decision to the women who had mercy, made himself loved more than feared. This was probably a good thing, considering that he was trying to be king of France. Starting your rule by executing people willy-nilly is probably not a good idea. Now, after that long quote about the pardoning of these 6 guys, it says France was ravaged by the Black Death, and the following year the plague spread to England. Now, I also sent you another map. We're going to be talking about the Black Death again, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail right now, because that's going to be your reading in a couple of weeks. But I sent you a map that looks like this. It has all these squiggly lines on it. It's called the spread of the Great Plague. I would like you to hang on to this map because we're going to refer to it again in a future video. Now, this is very timely. We are dealing with a virus that is spreading. And a lot of people are afraid, and we need to care for our neighbors. We love our neighbors as we love ourselves, right? So by not going out and potentially spreading the virus to elderly people or people who are unwell, we are showing love to them. But do not be alarmed that this virus is something like the plague. Mankind has known terrible illnesses. The plague was an illness that might kill you in less than 24 hours, and it killed the vast majority of the people who got it. This is nothing like the virus that's currently circulating, in which most people who get it are fine. They just are unwell for a little while and they're fine. Maybe they're never even unwell. But we have noticed something. If you look at the maps, the virus maps, and the way this is spread. This is only a few weeks ago that we were just hearing about it. And already there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have tested positive for the virus. So we see, interestingly, how quickly these things spread. Whereas today, we travel a lot. In the Middle Ages, they didn't travel a lot. But nonetheless, it managed to spread around on ships, taking goods to various ports. From goods, the merchant piles his goods on his cart and goes to the next town to the market, and then everybody comes to the market, and then it spreads. So on this map I sent you, it has dates. So at the bottom line, the most southernmost line, says December 1347. This is the line of where the plague had spread from the east by December 1347. By June, look how far it's gone north. By December, look how far it's gone. Now, in a year, the line moved up that far. So you can follow the spread of the plague. And the reason we're bringing this up today is because this happened after the battle. This is during the 100 Years' War. Edward has, and the Black Prince have taken themselves out of France, and now fighting is going to be suspended briefly because everybody's getting the plague. And a lot of people are dying. I think half of Europe died. Some people say more than that. Half or more of Europe died. So the King of France and the King of England are losing soldiers to the plague. And they're in a very weakened state. They're not able to resume the fighting for a while. We'll talk more about the specifics of the plague in a couple of weeks, but I just want you to keep in mind that that's going on at the same time. But by 1356, the plague had abated, and the Black Prince was back and fought at Poitiers. Look at your map of the 100 Years' War. And again, the English were successful. Why? Technology, right? Now, the King of France was captured and taken to England. Do you remember how they treated him? They treated him really well. It says the French king was in a vessel by himself to be more at his ease. He was allowed to sit and eat at his own table because he was so revered. He was such an important person. They lived well in England. And you might have read this and thought, why are they being so nice to him? Well, because at this point, they wanted ransom. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted money, and they wanted French land. Now, you might say, wait a minute, I thought Edward III was taking over France. He was, but he didn't have enough money and manpower to do it all at once. The plague had taken out a lot of his men, and he just wasn't wealthy enough to conquer all of France at once. So the best he could do right now was raise money, a lot of money. I think one estimate was today it would be the equivalent of $500 million, something like that he was asking. And he was also asking for a lot of the lands that had once belonged to England or the English royal family and had been lost over time. He wanted them back. So he wanted to negotiate. Now, he did get a lot of the land back. He never got most of the money. They set up an installment plan, I guess you'd say. The French were going to pay little by little. But the French didn't have a lot of money either. They just lost all these battles, and they'd had people die from the plague, and they just didn't have it. But eventually, they cut a deal. They signed a peace treaty. Edward gave up his claim to the French crown. In the north, he kept Calais, and King John was set at liberty after he paid a ransom. Like I said, he didn't pay the whole thing all at once. So that is the story of the first round of the 100 Years' War. All right, this is only the first round. Remember, 100 Years' War? 100 years. Now, that doesn't mean they were fighting constantly for 100 years. It was in spurts. And this was spurt number 1. In your reading for this upcoming week, I would like you to finish all of chapter 21 in the Dorothy Mills book. Finish chapter 21. And then we will talk about the rest of the 100 Years' War next week. And keep those maps by you, especially that 100 Years' War map. And the plague map we'll use the week after that. Before we end our video, let's take a look at some of your reading in the Joan of Arc book. Some of the things that I found particularly interesting or amusing. Starting, I'm actually not going to be able to know what chapter these are in. So I'll just tell you the part that I'm in. I found it very amusing. You know, Joan was traveling, and she was traveling to go see the Dauphin. She's got the guys from Vaucouleurs, from the governor. And do you remember how she ran into an enemy party? And they questioned her. They didn't know who she was. They asked, well, have you seen her? And Joan answered, she's still behind. This news softened the stranger's tone. He said, if you know that to be true, have you not lost your time, Captain? But are you sure? How do you know? Because I've seen her. Seen her? Seen the Virgin herself? Yes, I've been in her camp. And then she tells him where the camp is. And they ask, well, how many men does she have? I counted but 18, but she may have had 2 or 3 pickets out. Is that all? It won't be a mouthful for my force. Is it true that she's only a girl? Yes, she's no more than 17. Oh, it passes belief. Is she robust or slender? Slender. The officer pondered a moment or two. Then he said, was she preparing to break camp? Not when I had my last glimpse of her. What was she doing? She was talking quietly with an officer. Quietly? Not giving orders? No, talking as quietly as we are now. Because this is the officer she's talking about Joan talking to, because she is Joan and he doesn't know. I love that part. Moving on, though, she has second thoughts about what she feels like was lying to him. Joan is very upright. She loves God, and she's simple. Simple in the sense that she doesn't want to do anything wrong. And so one of her men is amazed at how she deceived him. This troubled Joan, and she said, I thought he was deceiving himself. I forbore to tell him lies. No, she didn't tell him anything that wasn't true, for that would have been wrong. But if my truths deceived him, perhaps that made them lies. And I am to blame. I would God I knew if I have done wrong. And they assured her that it was all right sometimes not to tell the whole truth. She said, Joan, you told us yourself that you were going to Uncle Laxart's to nurse his wife, but you didn't say you were going further, yet you did go on to Vaucouleurs. There. I see now, said Joan sorrowfully. I told no lie, yet I deceived. I had tried all other ways first, but I could not get away, and I had to get away. My mission required it. I did wrong, I think, and am to blame. She was silent a moment, turning the matter over in her mind, and then she added with quiet decision, but the thing itself was right, and I would do it again. It's very important to Joan to be morally in the right. She obeys the voices and she obeys God because it's God. And it is right to obey God. Notice it's not that she's not ever afraid or that she doesn't want to go back and live the life of a simple peasant girl in France. But she does what's right because it's right to obey God. Right, another place I wanted to look at together is the moment when she's going to meet the Dauphin for the first time. Remember what they did. He disguised himself. She had told messengers that she would know him anywhere. God would reveal him. So they decided to take her up on it. So he dressed up as one of his courtiers and had a courtier dress up as him and sit on the throne. But it did not fool Joan. She was still gazing steadfastly toward the throne, and I had the curious fancy that even her shoulders and the back of her head expressed bewilderment. She knows it's not him. Now she turned her head slowly, and her eye wandered along the lines of standing courtiers, till it fell upon a young man who was very quietly dressed. Then her face lighted joyously, and she ran and threw herself at his feet and clasped his knees, exclaiming in that soft, melodious voice which was her birthright, and was now charged with deep and tender feeling, God of his grace give you long life, O dear and gentle Dauphin. They try to convince her that she's got it wrong, but she knows she doesn't. She knows who it is. Moving on in your reading, let me find my place. I'm trying to find the place. Oh, here's what I wanted to talk about. This is when she's being tried, not tried exactly, she's being examined by the church court to see if her voices are truly from God. Remember, the Dauphin was on her side, but he has these muttering, plotting, scheming courtiers who just like life the way it is. Holed up with their king, safe, secure. They don't want to risk anything. And they don't want the Dauphin to risk anything. So they send her to the priest to have her examined to find out whether or not God is truly with her. And they decide that he is. But they also give her another special permission, which is going to be important later. There had been grave doubts among the priests as to whether the church ought to permit a female soldier to dress like a man. Now, you might wonder about that. It does say in Scripture condemns dressing like the other gender. All right, women dressing as men. Now, today we all dress as men. We all wear pants. I'm not going to make a comment on that one way or the other. But in this time, it was a no-no. But now came a verdict on that head, on whether or not she could change her dress. Two of the greatest scholars and theologians of the time, one of whom had been Chancellor of the University of Paris, rendered it. They decided that since Joan must do the work of a man and a soldier, it is just and legitimate that her apparel should conform to the situation. It's hard to be in battle in a dress. It was a great point gained, the church's authority to dress as a man. Keep that in mind. The church has given her authority, officially, to dress like a man because her job requires it, and God has given her the job. Okay, keep that in mind. One other interesting thing. Do you notice several times in this book, Joan looks at someone and she says, well, they're going to be with us. They're going to be helpful. She just seems to know. She just seems to choose the right people to be around her. And one of her friends calls it the seeing eye. And the person he's talking to says, seeing eyes? I hope my eyes see. And he says, no, you don't understand. He said the common eye sees only the outside of things and judges by that. But the seeing eye pierces through and reads the heart and the soul, finding there capacities which the outside didn't indicate or promise, and which the other kind of eye couldn't detect. It sees as by intuition that this man is good for strategy, that one for dash and daredevil assault, the other for patient bulldog persistence, and it appoints each to his right place and wins, while the commander without the seeing eye would give to each the other's place and lose. She just seems to know whose talents are right for which situation. It reminds me of in Scripture when it says, man looks on the outer appearance, but God sees the heart. This was when Samuel was going to anoint a new king after Saul had gone bad. And he went to David's house and he kept looking at David's brothers and they were good looking and tall and he's like, oh, this would be a good king. No. You're looking on the outer appearance, Samuel. God sees the heart. It seems that Joan saw the heart too. She had the seeing eye. Now, Joan gathered up an army, but this was a pretty rough and tumble army. And Lahir, the general, was also the roughest and toughest of them all. They called him Satan. He was a tough guy. And when she got into camp, things were kind of rough, not very moral. And she made a rule: every man who joins my standard must confess before the priest and absolve himself from sin, and all accepted recruits must be present at divine service twice a day. Lahir could not say a word for a good part of a minute, and then he said in deep dejection, ah, sweet child, they were littered in hell, these poor darlings of mine. Attend mass? They're not going to do that. And he went on, and he says, well, I'll try. He says, but none of them are more likely to go to it than he was himself. Then there was another surprise for him, for Joan said, "But dear man, you are going." Impossible. This is lunacy." "Oh, no, it isn't. You're going to the service twice a day." He argues, and it says later, he did it. Well, he really went. It was hardly believable, but there he was, striding along, holding himself grimly to his duty, looking as pious as he could, but growling and cursing like a fiend. It was another instance of the same old thing. Whoever listened to the voice and looked into the eyes of Joan of Arc fell under a spell and was not his own man anymore. It just rubbed off of her. It just exuded from her the goodness and patience and hope in God. One last thing I'd like to look at. This is more about Lahir. She wants him to pray. And here's his prayer, which has become famous. "Fair Sir God, I pray you to do by Lahir as he would do by you if you were Lahir and he were God." It's kind of a do unto others as you would have them do unto you, only with God. "Do unto me as I would do to you if I were God." I don't know if that's a very good prayer or not, but that's the best he could come up with, and it became proverbial. For next week, I want you to finish Book 2, Volume 1, Book 2. There's 2 volumes, right? Volume 1 of this book has 2 books. So basically, you're just going to keep reading all the way through chapter 27 and stop there. That will take us halfway through the book. So until then, I wish you good reading. Leave comments for me at the bottom below the video, or email me or call me with any questions, comments, concerns. If you just want to talk over a passage in the book, lay it on me. And work on your papers. Take time with them. Make them as good as you can possibly make them. All right? Set it aside. Go back to it. Recheck it. And then send it to me next week. And I will see you next Monday. Have a good week. Bye-bye.